Jonathan Marshall thought he had everything under control, until a letter from a stranger revealed a secret that turned his life upside down. It turned out that his true heir had grown up in poverty, while his other children were living in luxury. You won't believe what he did next, but let's start from the beginning. Jonathan Marshall was a man who knew the meaning of success. Growing up in a modest family, he built his empire from the ground up. It took decades for his business to grow into a billion-dollar company that dominated the market. His life was filled with luxury, enormous houses, private jets, yachts, all part of his daily reality. But beneath this wealth, anxieties were creeping in that increasingly occupied his thoughts. Despite all his achievements, Jonathan felt lonely and uncertain about the future of his family. His children, James and Emma, were fully immersed in the privileged life their father had provided. James had never known what it was like to work. His time was spent on social events and expensive hobbies. Emma was more ambitious, but her ambitions didn't involve business. She spent her energy maintaining her social media image and cultivating connections with influential people. Jonathan knew his children had never faced hardship. They lived in a bubble of wealth that he had created for them. But one thought constantly nagged him. They weren't ready for a life without money. Each time he looked at his children, Jonathan found himself wondering, what if I'm gone tomorrow? Will they cope? Do they understand the value of success? He realized their lives, filled with luxury, had made them incapable of appreciating hard work, discipline, and responsibility. It tormented him. He began to question whether they deserved the money he would leave them. One night, sitting in his office with a glass of whiskey in hand, Jonathan made a decision. They need to learn to live differently. He couldn't allow his children to become people who simply spent money without understanding how it was earned. Jonathan felt obligated to teach his children an important lesson, even if it meant leaving them without the billions they were used to. The next morning, Jonathan met with his lawyer and announced his decision. He chose to leave his children only a symbolic amount, enough for a comfortable life, but far from the luxurious existence they were accustomed to. The rest of the money was to go to charity and to support his most loyal employees, who had been with him through all the highs and lows of his career. Jonathan knew his decision would cause a storm in the family, but he was convinced he was doing the right thing. His children needed to learn how to live on their own, without relying on his money. This was his final lesson for them, and he hoped they would pass the test. However, after signing the will, Jonathan began to feel nagging doubts. He believed in the rightness of his decision, but couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. This anxiety slowly grew, and then something unexpected happened. Life began throwing surprises at him that he couldn't foresee. When news of the will leaked within the family, the Marshall household turned into a battlefield. It was expected that Jonathan's children, James and Emma, would continue to live in luxury as they always had. For them, it was unthinkable that their father, who had always provided them with everything and more, could make such a decision. It wasn't just shocking news. It felt like betrayal. James, the 25-year-old heir, had lived his entire life in his father's shadow. He had never known what it meant to work, and every mistake or foolish act was covered up by the family's money. To him, the inheritance wasn't just a right. It was his destiny. Learning that there would be hardly any money left for him, he felt humiliated and betrayed. James became furious, feeling that his father had abandoned him to fend for himself. This decision hit his fragile sense of self-worth, as his entire life had essentially depended on money. Emma, his 30-year-old sister, was no less enraged. Unlike her brother, she knew how to manipulate people, especially her father. She always got what she wanted: a new house, a car, a trip to the other side of the world. All of it came at her request. Jonathan always gave in, thinking he was taking care of his daughter. But Emma never saw him as a person, more as a wallet she could control. And when she learned she had been cut out of the inheritance, she was filled with fury. How could her father betray her so openly? She immediately began plotting her revenge. At first, James and Emma acted separately. James, relying on his emotions, lashed out at his father with accusations. He tried to play on Jonathan's feelings, reminding him of the moments they had spent together, when his father taught him life lessons and promised that family would always come first. But Jonathan stood firm. The decision was final, and nothing would change. Emma, on the other hand, took a different route. She hired the best lawyers and tried to contest the will in court. But Jonathan had planned everything meticulously. The will was flawless. Emma didn't stop. She decided to gather dirt on all the family members, including James. She knew there was enough scandal in their lives to use to her advantage. If Jonathan wouldn't change the will, she would do it herself, exploiting her father and brother's vulnerabilities. The Marshall household became a war zone. Outwardly, it seemed like a family tragedy, but behind the scenes, there were hidden intrigues, manipulations, and outright attempts to seize control. James was slowly becoming a puppet in his sister's hands as she skillfully pulled the strings to get what she wanted. She pushed him to become more aggressive toward their father, while she continued to search for loopholes in what seemed like an airtight system. But then, in the midst of this family drama, something unexpected happened. Jonathan received a letter. It looked like ordinary mail, mixed in with daily bills and documents, but when he opened it, his world began to crumble. The author of the letter introduced himself as Thomas, a man who claimed to be his illegitimate son. Those few lines changed everything. It all began with an ordinary letter that at first glance looked no different from the dozens of others Jonathan received daily. It was neatly folded and had no special markings. Accustomed to handling business correspondence, Jonathan opened the envelope almost mechanically, thinking it was just another advertisement or bank notice. But soon, his eyes caught the lines that made him freeze in place. The letter started calmly, without excessive detail. A stranger named Thomas informed Jonathan that he had been born 32 years ago, and that his now deceased mother, a woman named Laura, had claimed Jonathan was his father. As Jonathan read, he felt the tension inside him growing. Old memories of Laura surfaced, their whirlwind romance, brief but passionate. She was the only woman who ever made him question the importance of money. They were young, and their relationship ended as suddenly as it began, without explanations or drama. He had never imagined that Laura could have had a child. But it got worse. Thomas claimed that his mother had never informed Jonathan of her pregnancy. She had decided to raise the child on her own, not wanting to disrupt Jonathan's life. She had passed away a few years ago, leaving Thomas in poverty, and completely unaware of who his father was. Thomas, having discovered the truth through letters his mother left behind before her death, wasn't seeking money. He demanded nothing. But one detail in the letter changed everything. Under the laws of the state where Thomas was born, as the first and eldest son, he was the sole legal heir to Jonathan's entire estate. This news stunned Jonathan. He was paralyzed, rereading the line over and over, unable to believe his eyes. Questions began swirling in his mind. How is this possible? How could I not have known? He had left his own son in poverty, while his other children lived in boundless luxury. These thoughts tormented him. His entire life now seemed intertwined with this tragedy. What if Thomas is telling the truth? What if he really is my son? If that were true, everything Jonathan knew about his family and legacy was now in question. His careful plan to prepare his children for independent life by leaving them without a vast inheritance suddenly seemed meaningless. His decision, which once appeared so right and rational, now looked foolish. There was someone Jonathan had never accounted for, his eldest son, who had been raised in hardship while the others bathed in wealth. This thought consumed Jonathan. The internal conflict intensified. He felt guilt toward Thomas, even if it turned out to be a lie. But if it was true, how could he continue living, ignoring the existence of his firstborn? How could he cope with the burden of having possibly deprived his own child of a chance at a better life? Jonathan realized he couldn't delay addressing this matter. He decided to meet Thomas. The man wasn't asking for money or making demands. He only wanted one thing: a meeting. Jonathan didn't know what to expect, but he knew it had to happen. They arranged to meet at a restaurant on neutral ground. As Jonathan arrived, his heart was gripped by mixed emotions. He felt fear, guilt, and curiosity, all at once. When Thomas entered the restaurant, Jonathan immediately recognized him. The young man didn't just resemble Laura. There was something of Jonathan in him as well. The way he carried himself, how he glanced around, even the slight carelessness in his movements. These traits were too familiar. The world Jonathan had built for decades collapsed in an instant. Thomas didn't say anything unnecessary. He simply sat down at the table, waiting for Jonathan to begin. But Jonathan was overwhelmed with emotion. He realized the weight of the truth now unfolding before him, a truth that threatened to destroy everything he had believed and fought for. Thomas was his son. Thomas was, in every sense, the living embodiment of a young Jonathan. As Jonathan sat across from him, he didn't just see a physical resemblance. He saw the same strength and confidence that had driven him through his own years of struggle and success. It was like looking into a mirror, one that reflected not only the person he was, but also all the mistakes, missed opportunities, and decisions he once thought were right. They sat at the table, and the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first few minutes, neither of them dared to speak. Thomas remained silent, studying Jonathan, while Jonathan, in turn, searched for words, attempting to quell the storm of emotions raging inside him. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice calm but tinged with a deep-seated pain that had clearly built up over many years. He recounted his life growing up in poverty, how his mother, Laura, had kept the truth about his father hidden from him. Laura had been a strong woman, but according to Thomas, she had never complained, nor did she blame Jonathan. She had raised him alone, hoping that one day she would find the right moment to explain why their life had turned out the way it did. However, her untimely death left Thomas with countless questions, with only a collection of letters to provide the answers. Thomas described how, after her death, he found those letters, dozens of lines filled with love and plans for a future that had never come to pass. In them, Jonathan had written about his dreams, about how they could build a life together. But then something had gone wrong. Fate had taken a different course, and they had lost each other, leaving behind an unfinished story and a son Jonathan had never known existed. Every word Thomas spoke hit Jonathan like a hammer blow. He sat there, listening to his son, struggling to reconcile the reality in front of him with the life he had lived. Jonathan's mind drifted back to memories of Laura, their short but passionate love, the plans they had made, which had fallen apart due to circumstances outside their control. He had never known she was expecting his child. That fact alone felt like a punch to the gut. As Jonathan processed everything, one agonizing truth stood out. While his other children were basking in luxury and spending millions on their whims, Thomas, his firstborn, had been fighting for his existence, living in deprivation. Jonathan could no longer hold back his emotions. The magnitude of his own blindness and the mistakes he had made began to crash down on him. He realized that everything he had built his life around, his principles, his decisions, even the will he had just drafted, was flawed. His attempt to teach his children the value of hard work by cutting them out of the inheritance now seemed futile. The real lesson was staring him in the face. He had neglected a son who had truly struggled, while trying to teach the ones who had never known hardship. Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. He knew he had wronged not only Thomas, but his entire family. He had been wrong in every way. As a father, as a man. For years he had been blinded by his own pride, convinced that he was making the right choices. But now, with his firstborn sitting across from him, the truth was undeniable. He had failed. He knew he had to make it right before it was too late. When Jonathan returned home, he immediately called his lawyer. He couldn't wait another day to rewrite his will, to make the changes that reflected his newfound understanding of what was truly important. This time, Jonathan included Thomas as a primary heir. Thomas hadn't asked for it, but Jonathan knew he had to do it, as an act of redemption for the years his son had spent in poverty, unaware of who his father was. Everything was different now. Jonathan finally understood that money, control, and legalities meant nothing compared to the responsibility and love he had failed to offer his own flesh and blood. But the hardest challenge still lay ahead, telling his other children about Thomas. How would James and Emma react? How could he explain to them that they had a brother they never knew about, and that the inheritance they were expecting would now be shared with someone they might see as a stranger. Jonathan knew this would provoke a storm of anger and disappointment. He was prepared to face the likelihood that his children would reject not only his decision, but possibly even him as well. Yet Jonathan was ready. He knew he was finally making the right choice, choosing truth over lies, love over wealth. His task now wasn't just to explain everything to his children, but to teach them the hardest lesson of all, that the true value of life lies not in inheritance or money, but in how we treat those we love. This was the most difficult test of Jonathan's life. He would confront the turmoil in his family, knowing that his actions might alienate James and Emma, but believing that, for the first time, he was acting as a father should. And as for Thomas, Jonathan hoped this new chapter would finally bring them the relationship they had both been denied for so long.